the influences of the media.
Teenage savages go wild in a juvenile jungle of lust and lawlessness.
A flood tide of filth threatening to pervert an entire generation of our American children.
I'm Dr. Ben Litherland.
And I'm Dr. Richard McCulloch.
We research media audiences.
And this is Ill Effects, the good podcast about bad media influences. Hey, Ben.
Hello.
What do you know about a Netflix series called 13 Reasons Why?
What do I know about it?
Did you watch it? I guess is probably the first thing to ask.
Yeah, so I know. I thought I'd got through the point in my life where, like, I sat around pub tables, being like, "Yeah, maybe I'll watch it," and I didn't think I was going to be asked again. I thought I'd survived. And,
I still haven't watched Lost.
Yeah, exactly. It's like. Just been put on a podcast being like, did you watch this TV show that was hit 4 years ago? I'm like, no, I didn't. I'm sorry.
No.
I should have done. I didn't. I was like, yeah, maybe I will watch it. It was on a watch list, which is if I'm in the pub with you and you're like, you should watch it. And I get my phone, I'm like, I'm going to put it on a watch list. That's a lie. I just want out of the conversation.
Fair enough. Okay, I guess the more pertinent question for the purposes of the podcast that we do is, do you know why I have chosen to talk about this show and what kinds of effects or influences issues we may be getting into with this today? So
I suppose teen suicide is the episode, a nice cheery episode. This week, I assume in the TV show, a character dies by suicide or multiple characters die by suicide, or it's a running theme. When I was younger, there was a book that was turned into a film called The Virgin Suicide, which was about a family of sisters that all die by suicide. So I genuinely don't know. I've watched a trailer in passing in preparation for this episode, and that's literally all I've done. I remember... When did this come out?
2017.
2017. So I've had COVID twice since then. So like my memory is very hazy.
Yeah.
But I remember it being controversial to some extent. I assume that was what the controversy was about. But that is literally all I know. So I'm excited to learn more.
All right. I was fascinated by this controversy when it happened because this is ill effects all over the place.
Okay.
It is as soon as we talked about making this podcast, I wanted to do an episode on this show because there was a huge panic around it. I guess I should say from the outset, the episode, the question that we're dealing with in this episode is: did 13 Reasons Why cause teen suicides? As in, the TV increase
show.
them.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's what we're dealing with today. So I guess for the purposes of listeners, it's we're going to be dealing with some pretty heavy topics. So if that's an issue, then maybe listen later or another time or skip this one if you have to. All good. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating case study in media effects and media panics. This was a huge hit back in early 2017. It was the most tweeted streaming show of the year of 2017. So it wasn't just popular in terms of views, that a lot of people were talking about it as well. It's generating a lot of buzz.
That's why I was telling people I was gonna watch it.
Exactly. Right. But it's that buzz and that conversation was not entirely positive, despite a lot of people being into it.
Sure.
A lot of that was criticism as well. But yeah, in terms of the positive stuff, it was making a lot of people's end of year lists. It was one of the most binge watched shows on Netflix of 2017. I think the third most binge watched show, as in shows that people watched more than 2 hours of per day when they were watching it.
Okay.
Right. So they were watching more than one episode.
Sure.
And in members polls, like tens of thousands of Netflix subscribers, it was second only to Stranger Things on a list of things that people like to watch together as a family that year.
Okay.
And it was also second in that same poll in a list of shows that made people cheat on their significant others with with, as in you're supposed to be watching it together and then, I can't help and wait for them. I've got to skip ahead.
Okay.
That sort of thing.
I'm glad you explained that, because I was this is a really weird effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was that phrasing was how it was used when it was reported by
Sure.
Netflix, so that's why I offered the explanation.
Okay,
Anyway,
good, thank you.
Probably worth starting off with a brief plot outline for your purposes, certainly, Ben,
Please,
but
please,
also
please.
For the benefit of listeners who haven't heard of or watched the show. I'm not going to go into tons of detail about it, but the basic premise is that it's an American high school, and there's a 17-year-old girl called Hannah Baker who has died by suicide at the point where the episode starts. The school is kind of just about coming to terms with it. It's like been a week. And then one boy called Clay Jensen, he receives a mysterious box. This is a week after the death.
Okay.
A mysterious box of tapes on his doorstep. He presses play, and it turns out that it's essentially a series of suicide notes from Hannah. So it's her voice, and there are 13 tapes, 13 reasons why she decided to take her own life.
Okay. It sounds quite pulpy.
In what way?
I don't know. That's a murder mystery. It sounds high school, teenagery. I'm already like, is this actually how like teen suicide plays out or works out, or like I'm intrigued, but that's my initial response to the plot.
I mean, I wouldn't take this as representative of the real case studies or whatever, but there are elements of the story which are based in reality.
Okay.
Worth saying, it was based on a novel by J. Asher that was published a few years before, which was also quite controversial. It generated a lot of buzz, a lot of controversy, a lot of publicity, some positive comments, a lot of people very concerned about it as well. I should probably say from the outset, I am going to be quite critical of a lot of the backlash against this series. Not so much because I enjoyed the series and want to defend it, but because of the methodological problems of the research, and it fits in very well with a lot of the critical commentary that we make on this show generally.
Yeah.
I will also be critiquing, a fair bit of research from suicidologists. I would hope that this would go without saying, but I'm not criticizing the job that they're trying to do. And I'm willing to accept that they're making good faith arguments. Their heart's in the right place. They want to prevent teen suicides and suicides more generally.
I think this is interesting because we've done a fair few episodes at this point, and it's very enjoyable sometimes to laugh at some of the research. Some of the kind of the stakes of the research are quite low, like ultimately. And I think it's potentially the first episode where it's actually can be quite hard to be somebody who's pushing back against effects when there's a lot of people in the room who want to be making a causal link and their hearts are in the right place and they do good work perhaps in their with their industry and their day-to-day lives. It isn't all taking the piss out of psychologists and having a laugh and being like, this is wild. Sometimes it's actually quite difficult.
Yeah, and some of the discussions we have to have around this stuff is quite serious, like in terms of the arguments we're trying to make. We're not just trying to dunk on a particular field or a particular set of, area of research just for the lols kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's not really our intention, even though we do that in some other episodes.
Yeah. I suppose the point of academic research and the idea of productive debate, I suppose. So it might not be one of our funniest and funnest episodes, which you probably worked out. Listeners probably worked that out for themselves.
Yeah, but I genuinely think this is so interesting, this case study and the controversy around it. And as I say, this was one of the first episodes I wanted to do.
You've been talking about it,
Yeah. Okay, well, let's start with a clip then, because I think it's good for you to get a sense of the more precise nature of the claims against it. What were people saying? What kinds of arguments were they making? What did that seem to be based on? I've got a clip for you now from the BBC Media Show, which is a Radio 4 radio show in the UK, but also a podcast.
Well, Netflix says that 13 Reasons Why is suitable only for adults, but mental health campaigners say that Netflix is acting irresponsibly. In the UK, traditional broadcasters are subject to strict rules as to how suicide is dramatised. But Ofcom, the broadcasting code, doesn't apply to Netflix because it's based outside the UK. Well, earlier on I spoke to Jed Flynn, Chief Executive of Papyrus. That's a charity that seeks to prevent suicide among young people. He told me that since 13 Reasons Why was released by Netflix, they've seen an increase in calls to their helpline. I spoke to him earlier about the way that British broadcasters treat the subject of suicide.
We're all very keen to talk openly and honestly about suicide. But one of the things I'm very proud about in this country, we've got two sets of guidelines. One for print media, which is the Editor's Code of Practice, and then Ofcom guidance, which is about broadcast media. In both, really, the depiction of suicide is frowned upon because it leads to two things broadly. It intrudes into grief of those left behind after a suicide. So there's appropriate caution about talking about suicide in a sensationalist, romanticised way and talking about detail. And that leads on to the second point, which is essentially if you show graphic images of suicide, you risk simulative acts, as it says in the guidance. So that means, for want of a better term, potential copycat behaviour.
That is quite a strong thing to say. Is there really evidence or research that would suggest this could push vulnerable teens towards suicide?
Most of your listeners will remember in Bridgend in South Wales there was a number of young suicides, and Papyrus was very heavily involved in supporting those who were trying to manage the media, and our press office was very engaged at that time in 2008. There was something like 14 suicides in a very short period of time. And when we asked for a global cessation of coverage, the number of suicides reduced significantly and then stopped. And we know through that experience that the depiction of images of suicide, or even the glorifying the dead, in a sense, showing the beautiful faces of young people, big pictures, very pretty girls and so on. That sounds terribly sexist, but that's what the problem was. The media was showing these young people as almost role models, and then a vulnerable young person then thinks, at worst, they're getting the attention that I need. And if you are already suicidal, this exposure can compound that sense of validation of suicide.
Now, I know you've watched some of this series, some parts of the series. Do you think that it creates those problems?
This is a very fine line for us as a national charity. But I think this series, particularly the depiction of the scene where the young person effects her own death, it is absolutely graphic. I spend my life, personally and professionally, saying one thing: let's talk openly, honestly and publicly about suicide. But there's a little asterisk at the end of that phrase, and the asterisk points to this: if we talk about suicide method, we're putting lives at risk.
What's your initial reaction to that, Ben? What were some of the arguments that jumped out at you?
So, yeah, my initial reaction is, I suppose I'll start with that he seems like a good faith actor.
Yes.
Which isn't always the case, actually. He's very sincere.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that the things that he is saying, he means.
Yep.
That he works hard to want to reduce suicide. My second reaction is that the evidence that is asked for is flimsy, maybe even non-existent. Intriguing, the case study. So I think the only bits of kind of, I guess, quantifiable evidence that are raised is an increase in calls to the hotline.
Yep.
And the 14 suicides in and around Bridgend.
Yeah.
Which is that attached to emo music? I have like a really vague memory rattling around my head about like teen suicide being linked to emo music around that same time. But as far as I understood it, there was 14 deaths in a small town, and then the charity asked for global coverage to be discontinued, and that reduced. They stopped. It
reduced the suicides and then stopped, is his claim.
But reduced from that 14 in a town seems like a tragedy on its own terms, but without sounding like horrible and crude, it's not an epidemic. Like,
it's a large number in a very small place.
Yeah, and it's probably you're probably
issue.
reaching the kind of point where that would be limited anyway. But I don't know. Like, all I know is 14 is a small sample size to be judging in a small town, to be judging kind of anything from. And then, unless I missed anything, I think that was the only evidence.
Yeah.
Given.
And what about the kind of claims he's making about 13 Reasons Why?
Yeah, so the idea of celebrating, glorifying was a running theme. Again, from the British context, I again, rattling around my brain, I do remember from kind of classes I've either taught or perhaps even sat in, the idea of like the method, the method of how people die by suicide. There's a lot of like copycats, the idea of like the copycat. So, you know, if you explain to people how they kill themselves, then there will be kind of copycats in the coming days and weeks. So I do know in the British press, whenever suicide is reported, you never know what the cause of death is, and there is always a link to the Samaritans and other things, which I presume there will also be in our kind of show notes.
Yep, absolutely. We'll be putting that in our show notes.
But the idea of like the copycat is the kind of the celebration of the person, the idea of like copycats, the idea of like all of those things were sort of running through the argument. Yeah,
we'll get into that kind of side of things more later in the episode. We're going to have a look at some published research on, you know, for want of a better word, copycat suicides, sometimes called suicide contagion.
Okay.
That's the kind of language that gets used. But yeah, it's the idea that one suicide could affect another suicide.
Sure.
And in particular, in the case of 13 Reasons Why, there are certain aspects of the show, both in its premise and in its, you know, the creative choices in terms of how the suicide is presented, how it's depicted, the fact that it is depicted, and things like that. That you do see the suicide method in the first season, or at least you did, which I'll come back to later.
Okay.
Those are so it's not just that it is a show about suicide.
Sure.
It is a show that is about suicide, which is doing suicide in a quote-unquote bad way.
Right, yeah.
A harmful way.
A harmful way.
Yeah. So that's the concern. And again, like you said, people like Jed Flynn, charities like Papyrus, who he works for, all sorts of other mental health campaigners, suicide prevention campaigners, they're all working towards the same goal.
Sure.
They want to prevent this kind of stuff from happening. And they're concerned about a show which they think might be part of the problem. What we're going to kind of explore in this episode is maybe the evidence that underpins those claims is in some cases non-existent, in some cases just flawed, or maybe it's correlation rather than causation and things like that. Certainly that I have some problems with it.
Okay.
It doesn't marry with what you and I know from decades of media and communications research about media audiences, about how people process information, what they do with it, how they incorporate certain kinds of information about the world, both through fiction and non-fiction, into their everyday lives, into their sense of self, their sense of identity. It just doesn't jar for me.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure there will be people listening to this podcast who will disagree with certainly my take on this kind of research, and that's fine. But we'll come back to that in the conclusion. The other thing I thought was really interesting about that was you mentioned the case study of the Bridgend suicides, which was the suicide cluster in South Wales. Again, I think that's really important, but we're just going to park that for a moment.
Okay.
We'll come back to that later in the episode again when we look at research, because I think that's there's a really great book by Anne Luce on the Bridgend suicides, which is going to be helpful for us in sort of critiquing some of the research in suicide studies.
Yeah.
But in terms of the show itself, I wanted to do just in this next section a little bit of kind of just talking about the show and the way that some of the claims being made about it, I don't think fully add up, right?
We've done this before. This is a classic Rich McCulloch move.
We talk about the text and then we broaden it out to research and audiences and things like that.
No, I think that idea of like, because I think you're right, like often I don't think you need to be a trained film studies person to be like, is the text actually doing the kind of basic claims that it's doing? And I think the way that you watch films of like that is quite a frustration for you when you do kind of come across effects is like, obviously you are interested in methodology, but sometimes it's like that's not even what the text says.
Yeah.
We've had like multiple episodes where like let's actually watch the film first before we start making accusations about what the film is doing or the TV show's doing.
I don't know if you caught it in that clip, but there's one bit where the interviewer says, "Oh, I know you've watched some of the show, or at least parts of it."
Yeah, I did miss that, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's things like that I think are quite telling. Like I mean, I don't think there's any harm in that. I mean, I completely sympathise. Like, there's this controversy breaks. Someone from the BBC phones up a charity, an organisation who's invested in that field, in that topic, and goes, "Can we have someone to do an interview with us on the radio?"
Yeah.
And there's a guy going, "I did actually watch the first episode, or I've seen clips from it, so I can probably talk about it a bit."
Sure.
So again, I'm not blaming the guy for going on and having this conversation. I think what I would appreciate a little bit more, not just from him, but generally when people make these claims about media text, is that if you've not seen it all, admit that you've not seen it all and acknowledge that might cloud your judgment. Like, I don't know how you can make arguments about a show glorifying or romanticizing something when you don't have a fully developed sense of the way the characters relate to each other, the narrative arc that they go on from episode 1 to episode 13.
Yeah, is it being delivered as a joke? Is it, what sort of music has it got? All of those textual elements are important to how people understand texts. Yeah. Audiences,
when they watch them and make sense of them and decide whether they like it or dislike it, whether they want to be like that person, whether they hate that character or whatever, they are using all of that information that they've digested, not just flicking ahead to one graphic scene and then going, "Oh, that's horrible. Now I feel like, like shit," or whatever.
It's like being in a book club and there's one person who turns up and they've not read the book, but they dominate the conversation.
Well, they read the Wikipedia page.
Yeah, well, if I had read it, this is what I'd think. Like, well, maybe we should watch it.
So I want to run through then a few of the claims the specific claims that were levelled at the show, and just push back a little bit. Like, not to defend the show specifically, even though I do think this was a really good series for teens and young adults particularly.
Oh, interesting. I'll add it to my watch list.
I knew you were going to make that joke or something. Right. But we get claims like this. So this is from the NASP, which is the National Association for School Psychologists, claimed. You can read this for us, Ben.
Unfortunately, adult characters in the show, including the second school counsellor who inadequately addresses Hannah's pleas for help, do not inspire a sense of trust or ability to help. Hannah's parents are also unaware of the events that lead to her suicide death.
Yeah. I mean, this is one where I do think they're sort of right, in the sense that the school counsellor character in the series is pretty useless. Mm-hmm. But that's clearly a choice in the series.
That's the storyline.
Well, he gets one of the tapes. So each one of Hannah's tapes, so I'm not sure if I explained this properly before, but each one of the 13 tapes is for a different person. So if you're listening to this, you're one of the reasons why. That's what she says.
Right, okay, right. Yeah.
So, and the central character is actually quite a really lovely, normal boy. And so a lot of the mystery that you alluded to before is kind of like, what could he have possibly done?
Right,
like, how has he played a role in this? And him being like incredulous about it. But the guidance counselor, the school counselor, he is the final tape. And yeah, so it's revealed. This is a spoiler, but it has been out for like 7 years at this point. The plot is very, very clear that this guy could have stopped her from doing what she did.
Sure.
Right? So she makes all these tapes. She's decided what she's going to do, but she actually, in making the tapes and pouring out all her feelings and her telling her story, she actually decides, oh, you know what? I feel a little bit better after having done that. I'm going to go and talk to someone about it. And she goes to talk to him, and he's just really crap with her. He asks all these like really judgmental questions and just pushes her in a direction which is just not cool. So he's getting a tape. So his failure to help her is a key point in the series.
Sure.
The NASP here is criticizing it as they've given a bad message, right? They've almost suggested that if you go for help, you're not going to get help. But I don't really think that's what's going on here. It's a dramatic device, which also clearly makes the point that there are people who could have stopped this from happening.
Yeah, sure.
Hannah's one of them, but also there are other people involved. And you can't just ignore how the series kind of frames that character in his actions. We're not supposed to like the school counsellor for
he's
being
a bad
crap.
guy, yeah.
He's rubbish. Like the whole way through, you're just thinking, come on, man, do your job properly.
Yeah.
And as for her parents being unaware, like, yeah, they are. But again, that's not a fault on them. Like, she decides to not tell them about the stuff that's going on in her life and shuts them out of it. And again, the show shows that to be a problem. Like, if she just talked to people about her issues, maybe this all could have been avoided.
I think what's quite interesting there is this is such a genre, kind of, it's tropey, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, all teen series have parents and teachers, the idea of them at a distance and that they fully don't understand or appreciate you.
Yes.
It's a storyline beat, but it sounds to me that this is drawing on quite a long history of representation of, you know, teenagers as misunderstood or not being listened to. And in some ways, I suppose you can flip it on the head of like that can be a feeling and an experience that teenagers have, and having a TV show that represents that in some ways. I don't want to say like it's stopping suicide, because I really don't think it is, but I think, you know, the story worlds that people engage with, sometimes it's nice to feel seen and to have versions of your own life dramatized in particular ways, and that might be dramatizing one aspect of that.
Yeah, 100%. And like we said before, it's not as though we're expected the shows or the films in question in the teen genre typically endorse that idea. Like they're saying, oh, isn't it great that parents are really distant, or if they don't understand you, they're usually saying this is a bit crap, isn't it? This is a problem. Right, so the next stuff we have here is actually from a BuzzFeed article about the controversy around 13 Reasons Why. It's a really good, if any of you, I disagree with most of the article, but if those of you listening were not familiar with the controversy or with the series, I think this is probably quite a good starting point, because it captures quite a few of the claims that are made about the show, and is one of the more articulations, I guess, of the arguments against it. I've got another quote for you to read out, Ben. This is from that BuzzFeed article.
Sure. After listening to the tapes, Clay comes to the conclusion, it has to get better. The way we treat each other and look out for each other, it has to get better. The intended message, and the one many fans are focusing on, is clear. Be kind. You could save a life. It's a noble idea, but unfortunately it's embedded in a show that doesn't effectively explore mental health and ultimately uses suicide as a catalyst for a revenge fantasy. Rather than a nuanced exploration of the complex reasons people kill themselves, experts say 13 Reasons Why presents a rather simplistic blame game, dangerously reinforcing the incorrect idea that suicide is the only way you can truly be heard, or that it can be used as a tool to make those who have hurt you suffer.
I think this is a good quote because it captures multiple arguments in one. I think the comment about mental health is actually fair. I would agree that the show doesn't really touch on mental health, really.
Sure.
Which, given its prevalence as a risk factor for suicide, maybe you could say that's a problem, or at least a strange omission, if you're going to be polite about it. However, I would say that Hannah, as a character throughout, is talking in pretty textbook depressive language, I would say. I'm basing that on my own experience and other people's experience who I know have had mental health issues. But the way she talks about life being empty and what would happen if I didn't feel anything anymore and things like that. Yeah. That kind of language, they don't use words like depression. They don't talk about mental health explicitly, but I think it's implied that clearly she's not in a good place. Sure. Not just because of the decision she ultimately makes, right? Other things from that quote that you just read out, Ben, the suicide as the catalyst for a revenge fantasy. Yeah. This was a big one for a lot of people.
Yeah, I can see that. Having kind of heard the storyline, I can see that being a kind of a bone of contention.
Yeah, and there is an element of kind of, that certainly on some of the tapes, she does kind of engineer some situations where someone who has wronged her gets a little bit of a taste of their own medicine kind of thing.
Yeah.
So she has a stalker at one point, and she encourages everyone else who's listening to the tapes to basically stalk him.
Right.
And, you know, hide outside his house, throw rocks at his windows and things like that.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I think it's reasonable to say, I get it why people have a problem with that
Sure.
aspect of it. The thing I find quite odd about that quote, though, experts say 13 Reasons Why presents a rather simplistic blame game, dangerously reinforcing the incorrect idea that suicide is the only way you can truly be heard. I think this is a really odd argument. Calling it a simplistic blame game, this was an argument that loads of people made about this show. And the show is literally called 13 Reasons Why. And it's made very clear in the show that really there are more than 13 reasons.
Right.
And it builds, one of the reasons I was really impressed by it is because I think it builds a really nuanced and quite complex picture of the events that precipitated her suicide, right? It's not just, oh, this bad thing happened and then I made this choice. It's an accumulation of loads of things, but also loads of people making different kinds of choices. Some of them do really horrible things to her. Other people do nothing. Or they are just kind of complicit in a way that they're like hanging out or like kind of supporting in some way someone who does something really bad. And it makes it very clear that those people are part of the issue as well.
I see.
And I can understand the comment of it being a blame game, but it's not simplistic.
No.
That really doesn't strike me as a fair argument. One of the other major claims made about the show, as we've already touched on, is to do with glamorizing or romanticizing suicide. So the Chicago Tribune, for example, said, the fact that Hannah tells her story after her suicide glamorizes the death and sends a potentially dangerous message to viewers. Ben, what do you think of when we talk about words like glorifying, romanticizing, celebrating? Are there any other films or TV shows that you think we can talk about in those terms that might be instructive for this discussion, even if they're not about suicide? Like, what does it mean to glorify something?
Yeah, it's the sort of terminology that always gets thrown up in this. And it's one of those terms that I think we all carry it around in our heads and we're like, yeah, okay, certain things are glorified in the media. And the assumption is that we want to do it because it like looks fun or cool or exciting. And there are whole industries, right, like built to glorify some, like the whole of the advertising industry is working on a logic that says if you drink this beer or buy these jeans or whatever, like you will be cool or, you will be sexually or romantically interesting to other people who are hot and, they will want to be with you or all of these other things. And like, we see this all the time. Like glossy magazines, fashion magazines, advertising. We are surrounded by a culture that apparently glorifies many things. Things as boring as like toilet bleach are supposed to be glorified. But also I carry around with me this kind of instinctive, like, but what does that actually mean? Does anyone think that toilet bleach is? And I'm shifting the conversation a little bit because on the one hand, we let everyone thinks advertising works. That is a common sense idea about advertising, and people spend a lot of money on advertising to glorify something. We're one step away that, like, the idea of glorifying suicide. So the makers of this TV show, presumably, not presumably, they're not trying to sell you the idea of suicide. If you do suicide, you'll be cool, like this character. Yeah. I've not seen the TV show itself, so we've criticised other people for kind of commenting on TV shows that they've not seen. But it doesn't sound to me like the storyline is presenting it as aspirational or something that you want to do yourself, which I don't think is true of advertising. I think advertising, there's a very clear thing of like, this is aspirational, you should do it.
And we want you to buy it.
And we want you to buy it. And whether that works or not is a different question. So to me, that phrase is already, it's clunky in the context of something where I think all of us broadly agree this is what adverts are trying to do. So I get a little bit, I don't know, squeamish around the idea of suicide being glorified.
Yeah.
And that's even before we get to the supposed people that are going to buy into this.
It's a really bizarre argument. I really don't understand this at all, because I think it only makes sense if you cherry pick which bits of the text you are focusing on.
Right.
So if you say, okay, so the idea that she sort of lives on after she's dead through the tapes, okay, lots of good-looking people, great soundtrack, interesting and exciting murder mystery kind of plot.
Yeah.
If you just mention those kinds of things, then all right, yeah, that does sound a bit like it might be building something very potentially, well, it is very tragic, into something that might be a bit more exciting and appealing.
Yeah.
But you'd also have to ignore pretty much everything that happens in the entire series.
Yeah.
Because it was a horrendous watch. And I mean that as a compliment, to be
Sure.
honest. Like, it's a really tough watch. The other thing worth bearing in mind when we're considering what we mean by glamorizing or glorifying or romanticizing is one of the other terms that was often used alongside. We heard it in the clip before. It's about the graphic depiction. The graphic depiction. And I find it really strange that people are using the terms glorifying and graphic depiction of suicide alongside each other. Because
Yeah.
I don't see how it can be doing both of those two things. And certainly, I'm not trying to speak for everyone, but my experience of watching the show was that I was gripped and wanted to know what happened, but I was also spending a lot of time just in horror, all the awful stuff that happens to this poor girl, and to be honest, loads of the other characters as well. As Jed Flynn sort of suggested before, the scene where she does end her life, is certainly in the context of a teen show aimed at young people on Netflix. I think it's one of the most horrific kind of teen show kind of scenes I've ever watched. I was really moved by it, really upset by it, but in a sort of what I would consider a productive way. I cannot imagine, like, there's so much emphasis on the parents' grief, for example, and things like that. And I don't understand how you can watch that and then think, yeah, that's celebrating this.
Yeah. I'm trying to think about like parallel case studies. I'm trying to think about like celebrities who've died by suicide. So like Ian Curtis or Kurt Cobain, where like they are quite celebrated, in the very explicit sense of the word. Like they are young and kind of beautiful, and they've written this music and they are glamorous. But even in that context, I don't remember like the images of the suicide being presented in. I'm just trying to kind of rack my brain in like culture of like when this has been presented in the sort of the way that this is something that is like, it's the way it's kind of told on the kind of criticisms of this show. I don't remember it. I don't remember ever seeing it in those terms.
Yeah, I'm the same as you. I can't think of any examples that do that. I mean, I guess we should say this isn't our area of expertise.
Sure.
So maybe there are examples and we just don't know about them. But it doesn't gel with what I have seen of representations of suicide and what I do know about the field and things like that. The final thing that I want to say in this section, where we're talking about the specific claims made against the show and why I think they're a kind of problem, comes from, well, one example I've got of this, but this is one example among countless examples, comes from Brooke Fox, who's a psychotherapist. She wrote a blog about 13 Reasons Why and detailed a bunch of the arguments that, a bunch of the problems that she has with the series, from her perspective as someone who, treats people who have suicidal ideation or maybe attempted suicide and things like that. She says 13 Reasons Why glamorizes suicide. So she's definitely making this argument.
Okay.
But the reason I wanted to focus on her explanation of it is because of what she bases that word glamorizing on.
Okay.
Or what she's setting it in contrast to. She says, reporting on suicide.org created recommendations as a guideline for the media on how to safely report on suicide. Research shows us that how suicide is reported has an impact on the public health of society. So we should therefore not sensationalize the suicide, not talk about the contents of the suicide note if there is one. We should not describe the suicide method. We should report suicide as a public health issue. We should not speculate about why the person might have done it. We should not quote or interview police or first responders about the causes of suicide. We should describe the suicide as died by suicide or completed or killed him or herself rather than committed suicide. And we should not glamorize suicide. Now, again, she doesn't explain what that precise bit means, but she goes on to say in her conclusions, the final bit of her blog, 13 Reasons Why breaks all of these rules. Violating these guidelines puts our teens at risk. Romanticizing the act of suicide in a medium that teens hold near and dear to their heart is dangerous and irresponsible. And I just wanted to ask you, Ben, whether you thought that there were any potential problems in applying that set of guidelines to 13 Reasons Why.
Yeah, so apart from the glamorized stuff, which we've spoken about, but even then, I mean, ultimately, this is about an ethics of journalism.
Yes.
Right? So I agree with all of these rules, but that's not necessarily to protect the wider public from them, although that might be a contributing factor. But a lot of this is just down to, like, the surviving family members or that actually it's not particularly useful. The police might not know, like, why the responding police officer speculating wildly, they're not doing their job properly, and you are not, as a journalist, doing your job properly if you report on this. So I think where you have led me, very, very professionally led me to the point of, like, this is a taking journalism best practice for fact-based reporting of real people and applying it to what we've already established as a genre piece of fictional television.
Gold star for you, Ben.
Thanks.
I was
Thanks,
prepared to just tell you off air and then you get the right answer, but I didn't have to do that.
All of that money I spent on these degrees is paying off.
Although the listeners don't know that, do they? I could just have told you to say that. Anyway, you're absolutely spot on, and this is absolutely rife throughout the controversy around 13 Reasons Why.
Yeah.
You get article after article after article berating 13 Reasons Why for its irresponsible reporting on suicide. It's not reporting on suicide. This isn't a real suicide. It's a drama series. It's fiction.
Yeah.
It's clearly fiction. The people who watch it, yes, all right, there will be elements of it that they might relate to and recognize in their own lives.
Yeah.
But they know the difference between fact and fiction. And as you rightly identified, responsible reporting guidelines for suicide for journalists are mostly about respect for the dead, and respect for their loved ones who are left behind. You don't want to add insult to injury and, compound their grief any more than you need to. I think the point about mentioning the suicide method is one that they do think might be a sort of they're worried about copycat effects.
Sure.
But also it's a kind of, you don't need to mention it.
No,
when you're
you don't.
reporting.
You don't.
So there's you might as well just not take that risk, even if there is no impact or direct effect.
Yeah,
let's just have that as a guideline, and that's better for everyone.
Yeah.
This brings us then to thinking about regulations and guidelines around depictions of suicide, because, like I said, this is a really bizarre misuse of very important guidance.
Sure.
To make claims about something which that guidance has not been designed to cover at all. So there are loads of organisations around that have various guidance for how you should and should not report on suicide. I've got some of them there for you. So the first page is from the World Health Organization. They're Preventing Suicide, a resource for media professionals. Broadly, they mean journalists, but I think it covers others as well.
Yeah.
And the next page beyond that is the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, which is a US organization. You can see that the two pages are pretty similar to each other, but what are a few of the bits of advice and the do's and don'ts that jump out from that advice?
So I suppose some of this, regardless of how you feel, I think this is sensible and good advice. And
Yep.
I wish we lived in a world where we perhaps didn't need to give this advice to journalists, but nevertheless, don't use sensational language in headlines. Is like, yes, agreed. Don't name or provide details about the site location. I get it. Don't use photographs, video footage, audio recordings. All of that kind of stuff. Completely agree. Stuff that I've always thought is really important. Like, again, regardless, I completely get this. The idea of like oversimplifying the reason for suicide. I think anyone who's been impacted by suicide, like, it's always there isn't a straightforward. There never is a straightforward suicide case. There's always multiple factors going on.
Yeah.
And I think, from there, not creating like easy narratives about like man goes into debt and suicide is release and solution from that. Like, completely, totally get it. That all seems sensible. Again, applying caution when interviewing bereaved family members. Like, I dread
Obviously,
to think. I hope journalists don't need that kind of reiterating to them, but maybe some of them do. So, like, there's plenty on here that I am fine with. Applying particular caution when reporting celebrity suicides. Yeah, all of this stuff seems. Even if I don't necessarily, I've not seen some of the data that's gone into this, but I'm mostly fine with this.
The one that you picked out on just towards the end there about not oversimplifying, I think, is one that really jumped out at me. Firstly, because of 13 Reasons Why and the fact that it's called 13 Reasons Why and is giving all these different reasons for Hannah's suicide.
Yeah,
and stuff.
interesting, yeah.
But I think it's really also doubly ironic because, well, the people who are making these claims about 13 Reasons Why doesn't adhere to this guidance, what are they doing when they make these claims about the show? They are making a very simplistic, I would say, cause and effect argument about the show and the specific depictions of suicide in it leading to suicide.
That's
so they are the ones actually who are running afoul of their own guidance that they seem to be so concerned about, which I think is interesting. And this brings us on quite neatly to the more specific effects claims that are made by a lot of the critics. So this backlash, yes, it was about the show and it was, picking out things that people didn't like about it, but it was specifically about what those depictions and creative choices might do to someone who might see it. Ben, I'm going to ask, I've got another quote for you to read out now. This is from an article in April 2017. This is like the height of the controversy. This is from the Star Tribune, which is a Minneapolis, Minnesotan newspaper. The headline is "Schools Caution Parents About 13 Reasons Why." If you could read that highlighted bit for us.
The rape scenes are very graphic, said Daniel Reidenberg, executive director of SAVE, a suicide prevention organisation. The violence in other scenes, where people are beaten, are incredibly graphic. The suicide scene itself is very graphic and very sensationalised. Anytime we have portrayals like that, kids can't often separate fiction from reality. This has mental health and school officials concerned about the contagion effect. The concern is that it could prompt people to attempt suicide, think about suicide, or die by suicide, Reidenberg said.
Now, with your...
I stopped to make a noise whilst reading it. Yeah.
With your ill effects / media researcher hat on.
Yeah.
How does that quote read to you?
It winds me up. And again, it's a lot. It's been much easier to like crack a joke and laugh at Republicans in earlier episodes. I feel bad. Daniel Reidenberg sounds like a perfectly... he's doing good work, and I appreciate the work that he's doing. But also... the idea that kids can't often separate fiction from reality, like, there's a terrible, and it's a very terrible voice in my head just being like, shut the fuck up. Like, what are you talking about? And it's easier when that voice is to, like, people who've, like, would, like, living in 60, 70 years ago and not people who are trying to prevent teen suicide, which is, like, yes, we should be. But, like, it still winds me up, even when it's... This is a really long way of saying it. It annoys me. Like, it it bugs me, and I can see why this bugged you.
It really bugged me. A lot of the quotes that I choose for you on other episodes are ones that I actively want to annoy you.
Yeah.
This is one that I didn't so much want to annoy you with for my own amusement, because I don't think it is amusing in that sense. It's just I had the same reaction as you.
Yeah.
There is a whole field of research into young media audiences, children's audiences, media consumption.
Yeah.
That has absolutely put this argument to bed decades ago.
Yeah, it's so frustrating, isn't it? This is something, part of the reason, I guess, because we've done quite a few episodes now, and from the start, for us, this debate always feels settled. Like, there's no evidence. There's never been any evidence that young people in particular, and people in general, struggle to separate fiction from reality. We've been hunting for it for over 100 years, and if we had that evidence would have been like, you would have heard about it, because people really, really wanted this to be true.
They want it to be true, yeah.
And people still want it to be true, and it still gets spoken about in these terms constantly. And, you know, we're two dudes with a podcast, and people are listening, which is nice, people are listening, but ultimately, like, I want to get rid of this discourse. Like, I really need this discourse to go away. Like, I am sick of this discourse because it stops us having actual conversations about what we should be having conversations about, which are difficult conversations and which are hard conversations to have. So I'm going to end my rant, but like that's it frustrates me no end when this is sort of raised in somewhere as prominent as a big daily, local or national newspaper.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is like pretty much the whole reason we started this podcast in the first place, is because me and you had been arguing about like seeing stuff like this in the media for years and going, why is this still happening?
Yeah.
Why do people not stop making these stupid, silly, sometimes funny, sometimes offensive, sometimes
just sad.
Yeah,
it's
just really sad, like arguments.
Their instinct.
And yet, it never seems to end. And this is one of the reasons we wanted to first of all, we knew that there was a lot of material out there for us to get our teeth into, but also that we might be able to help encourage some listeners out there who maybe have, they get little red flags go off when they see some of those claims, but maybe they've never looked at the research themselves, or maybe they don't. They like, it smells like bollocks, but I'm not totally sure why it's bollocks or if it's true, or maybe there's some truth to it.
And it's so interesting because the part of academia that we come from, there's a part of academia that we have come from in like our social worlds where people think this debate is over.
Yeah.
They go, we won.
Yeah.
People never don't think about the audiences like this anymore. And I was like that until like a few years ago. I was like, oh, don't worry. The active audience, don't worry. Everybody knows this now. No one knows this. We're just chatting to ourselves. It's kind of wild because ultimately once you step out of a very, very narrow subset of a kind of part of the university into the quote unquote real world, as we've already seen newspapers, BBC coverage, all of this stuff, it's kind of just there constantly. Like we've not got rid of it.
And you can't, and it's not like you can even go, oh, it's just the Daily Mail and Fox News. Like it's rife, and it's smart people, it's academics, it's
left, right,
people who work
liberal,
for charities.
centre. It's kind of incredible, really, to see that line. Kids can't often separate fiction from reality.
So in a sense, then it's not surprising that a lot of the coverage around this, like you said, people want this. It's almost like people want this argument to be true because it feels true to them. It feels like a common sense kind of thing. I've put some images in front of you of some headlines. We're not going to dwell on this stuff, but I just wanted to kind of give you a short little sample of some of the coverage of real suicides that happened in the wake of the series release, and they were linked, right? So people saying things like, family of teen who committed 13 reasons why copycat suicide urges Netflix to cancel show.
Yeah.
After her daughter's copycat suicide, this mother is warning young people about 13 reasons why. I'm not going to go on, but like, they're really sad stories, as you'd expect. There are elements of some of them where you can sort of see why they said it, but I mean, again, it's really, I don't call this evidence. It's anecdotal at best, and it's like really a lot of the links are quite tenuous. It's that, they left notes in the form of a tape. Therefore, they were influenced by
Yeah.
13 Reasons Why. And there's, you know, I don't want to dwell on this stuff, but
And again,
it's predictable that these stories would come out.
it's predictable that these stories will come out, and I'm not blaming any parent who, like, it's a situation that I wouldn't even, I can't even imagine the pain, and that they're looking for reasons themselves, and if they want to think that honestly, like, is fine. It is not for us to be going in and saying this is how you should feel about what has happened, and for you to be drawing these links. I think what to me is interesting there, of, like you say, all of that, like, really sensitive stuff about reporting. I do think the journalists involved in this have a little bit of a, I don't want to say complicity, but they have a role in seeking out stories that go, okay, yeah, no, we can link this. I don't know. I'm intrigued as to how the trauma that these parents are experiencing and the things that they are saying, how that then becomes a news story in itself. I am interested in, and that's possibly worth exploring a little bit more.
And the value of a story like that, an emotionally laden story for a news agency, I just find that makes me really uncomfortable.
Yes,
like, I understand
agreed.
Why that would be an attractive story for a newspaper, a news website. Yeah. But I hate that it is.
Yeah.
But the point I'm trying to make is, so you kind of expect to see some stories like that. As sad as it is and as annoying as it is to us as media researchers, it's not surprising to see those kinds of things. And all these various arguments about why people think 13 Reasons Why is a dangerous show. But what did happen was that a lot of researchers took up this mantle as well and started making little observations. Initially, because it was, it takes a long time to publish academic research, but professional, like, suicidologists and therapists and things did little, very small scale observations and little tidbits, little editorial letters and things like that to journals, medical journals, health journals, just about things that they had spotted. So things like the fact that internet searches for suicide and related terms had gone up. Calls to hotlines were going up. Admissions to emergency rooms and A&E were going up. In the wake of this series coming out.
Yeah.
Now, I understand why any rise in any of those things would be potentially cause for concern, but actually I think some of them are not necessarily, like, I think increasing calls to a hotline, I think you could make the argument quite convincingly that that's a good thing.
Yeah.
At least in the sense that even if there was some kind of link between people watching a TV series and then, having some kind of suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you rather they phoned a hotline than not?
Sure. I'm going to ask a blunt question, and I'm going to ask it in its bluntest form just to see where it goes. Was there an increase in actual suicides of young people or teenagers?
We're going to get onto that very shortly, Ben.
Okay.
But yeah, your blunt questions will be answered. The first thing I wanted to say just before we get into that is that Netflix took these responses very carefully and put a series over a period of months and years, put a series of steps in place to, I guess, quell the backlash a little bit. So initially this meant adding warnings and content warnings and links to websites and hotlines to the beginning and after episodes. Bulking up their, like, behind the scenes, like they had an extra episode called Beyond the Reasons, where, like, the cast would talk about the issues raised in the show, including things like sexual assault and things like that, which are also a theme throughout the show.
I was gonna, and I'm not gonna say this bluntly. I'm gonna talk around it a little bit until I get to my point. But I suppose there is this fundamental question about representation here of, like, suicide. I think you were kind of indicating it a little bit of, like, people who call hotlines. The question there of, like, should we never represent these things because we don't want them we want them removed from the public sphere because they are bad things? Or that kind of question of, like, should we allow cultural spaces in which people can think about this? That perhaps even teens who are feeling suicidal can have spaces where it's discussed openly, where it's represented, where it's fictionalized, and that may or may not. And I don't want to make causal claims because I'm reluctant to to make causal claims about anything, and especially this. But I just think that kind of question of like, is this always bad? Is this always bad to have a space for teens to explore these feelings or these ideas in a way? I guess if I was more cynical, you could kind of flip it and say, actually, it's a good thing. It's an outlet. It provides a space to talk about it, and not talking about it is bad for society. And I'm not sure. I don't know where I stand. I just. Well, do you see what I'm saying?
I absolutely do, and I share your thoughts on that. I think that is what the show is doing. For my experience of watching the show, I did think it was doing positive work in that sense, in terms of like depicting a serious public health problem, an issue that affects loads of people's lives, young and old, and in between, and allowing. And you know, it was successful in generating a lot of conversation around this topic.
Sure.
And you heard before the clip that we listened to, you know, a lot of the campaigners say we do need to talk about this. This is a serious topic. We need to be able to talk about this seriously.
I suppose that question of what would a, you know, quote unquote good TV show that deals with teen suicide look like? I guess there's an interesting question.
Certainly
there.
a fictional one. I'm not convinced the people making the criticisms of this show know the answer to that question. They certainly don't seem to. I don't know how you know, even if we park for one side the very important problem that they were using journalistic guidelines to apply to fictional TV shows.
Yeah.
We still need to kind of think about, well, if you followed those journalistic guidelines in making a fictional depiction, you wouldn't really be able to have a show.
Yeah.
Certainly one about suicide and where you
don't have young and beautiful
really
people.
talked about anything.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be allowed like this series would not get made at all.
Sure.
I don't think you could make it. Which maybe they would say is a good thing, but all right. Well, let's get on to the research then, because
okay.
I think it's
I'm ready for it.
It's interesting to think about how Netflix responded to this. I think they interestingly, or one thing I will mention just before we move on, they edited the suicide scene from the end of the first season. So I rewatched season 1 in preparation for this.
Okay.
And I watched it and I was like, hang on, this isn't anywhere near as graphic and, you know, upsetting as I remembered. And then I went and looked it up, and they had pretty much removed most of the scene. And certainly all of the detail around method and things like that, which seems to be in response to the backlash. And I don't think it harms it certainly doesn't harm the plot.
Okay.
I think it diminished the power of the message. I think it made it easier to watch.
Did they put out like a statement as to what they'd done and why they'd done it?
Netflix did make a statement about this. I won't get you to read it out just for sake of time. I don't think the precise wording is super important. But the basic argument they were making is that they wanted the show to portray, they said, the ugly, painful reality of suicide. Right?
Yeah.
That's the reaction that I had is kind of what they were going for, basically.
Yeah.
And wanted to make sure no one else would want to emulate it. But they listened to a lot of the advice and the backlash, pretty much.
Okay.
And they decided to re-edit it. And they said no one scene is more important than the rest of the show. We need to take care of each other better. We think this will help the show do more good for young people.
Okay.
So
Interesting.
I don't know if it was. I get the impression it was probably a sensible PR decision for them to make rather than an artistic one.
Sure.
Now, Ben, you asked before about the research involved in this, and whether you described it as a blunt question, like you wanted to know whether there was a rise.
Yeah.
The short answer is yes.
Okay.
There was a study that came out that did show a rise in the number of suicides in the months that followed the release of 13 Reasons Why.
Okay, that's interesting.
That study didn't come out until a year or two after the controversy, though.
Sure,
because
yeah.
it takes time to do
Yeah,
this
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of stuff and to do that kind of analysis. But at the time, it was very much talked about as, this is the proof,
evidence.
this is the
Yeah.
evidence. We all speculated on it, we knew, and now we've gotten banged to rights. But what I want to do is to poke a few holes in that research, maybe not that specific study, but certainly the central model or concept that is at the heart of that study.
Okay.
Because it is a really, really, really important concept in the field of suicide studies. It is used again and again to explain media effects on suicide. and I think it's bollocks.
Okay. Is that the technical term?
Yes, it is. So the concept we are talking about now is called the Werther effect.
Okay.
It is named after a book by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the German pre-Romanticist writer in the 18th century.
Okay.
He wrote a book in 1774 called The Sorrows of Young Werther.
I've got,
it was
stuff
his-
is rattling around my brain now, like memories are, okay, yeah, sure.
It's quite a famous book, but
Yeah.
Goethe is obviously a famous author, but it was his kind of like breakthrough hit sort of thing. Like
Yeah.
It was his big novel that got people's attention. Apparently Napoleon Bonaparte like carried a copy with him,
Okay.
like when he was in Egypt campaigning and things like this. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that the Werther effect is a term coined by a researcher called David Phillips in 1974, but based on, it's named after Werther, the central character of that novel by Goethe, because in that novel, the central character Werther, he dies by suicide. As a sort of, because he's, it's an unrequited love story.
And there was
basically.
supposed to be young men across Europe
Yes.
that the copycat stuff.
There you go.
Yeah.
Never properly proven if that was really happened. The sociological data doesn't really exist.
18th
from
century,
yeah.
death data is not a good data set to be
So
working from.
we don't have the data to be able to say that it's absolutely nonsense, but there's also not really much reason to put a lot of stock in it, that it was a real phenomenon. But yeah, allegedly it was a very popular book, and there were allegedly a number of young men who took their own lives, whilst holding a copy of the book or dressed like the character and, things like this. There's sort of tenuous copycat links. The article this comes from is called The Influence of Suggestion on Suicide, Substantive and Theoretical Implications of the Werther Effect, as I said, by David Phillips in the American Sociological Review. Now, one of the things I found interesting about this, because I actually read a load of critiques of this article before I read the original article.
Yeah,
so
classic.
I already went into it thinking, I'm not going to like this and this is going to annoy me.
Yeah.
But what I found really interesting about when I actually read the article is that the first page of it or so, or first couple of pages really, is kind of a lit review, which is what you'd expect. But it's a lit review where he's citing all these things that make you think, well, why are you doing this study in the first place?
Sure.
I'll give you an example. So in the first couple of pages, he says things like, again, he's quoting from other scholars who have written about suicide and suggestion here. Widespread imitation of Werther's suicide was never conclusively demonstrated. Durkheim reviewed research linking suicide and suggestion and found no conclusive evidence relating imitation and the social suicide rate. Lester noted that the results of some studies were inconclusive, contradictory, or could be explained by processes other than imitation. It goes on like that. There's like 2 pages of examples where he's just going, this person didn't find a link, this person didn't find a link, this person didn't find a link. And then after all that, he goes on to say, so it's all this kind of stuff like there's no evidence, there's no evidence, there's no evidence.
Yeah.
In this paper, I will use American and British statistics to show that the number of suicides increases after the story of a suicide is publicized in newspapers.
Right, okay. Does he use new data? I'm intrigued about this relationship of...
He uses, population level studies, like statistics on suicides.
Yeah.
Post-war, he's looking at.
Yeah.
And he correlates that with New York Times coverage of high-profile suicides.
Right, okay.
Okay. That's pretty much it. So he gives an example before he gets into the analysis. He says, the use of this technique can be illustrated in the case of Daniel Burros, a leader of the Ku Klux Klan who committed suicide on November the 1st, 1965, when the newspapers revealed that he was Jewish. In the month after, we don't have time to get
all right.
Anyway, in the month after Burros's death, November of 1965, 1,710 suicides were recorded. There were 1,639 suicides in November the previous year and 1,665 suicides in November of the subsequent year. So the average is 1,652, and the year after that particular, the month of that suicide, it was 1,710, which is greater than the expected number. So there was a rise in suicides just after Daniel Burros killed himself.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is noisy data. This is potentially really tenuous. I hope this study does something a little bit more than that.
Nope.
Okay.
Well, it does it with a lot more. It does it with a large number of, articles, and it's once you've made the decision that that's your method, it does a reasonable analysis of it in terms of the numbers and stuff. But I think fundamentally, if I was supervising a dissertation student who came to me with this as an idea, I would probably talk them out of it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Because I don't
want a second market. So, where do we start? I'm making noises. Talk me through to our listeners. What don't you like about this?
All right. Well, there's a few technical, methodological issues which I don't like about it. We can question whether this is a representative sample. Is the New York Times a good choice of paper that would be available to and would it be read by multiple social classes?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Definitely not.
Would it... so also the sample was based on a post-war period. I'm taking these points are from Anne Luce's book on the Bridgend suicides, by the way, which I'll come back to in a minute. But she talks a lot about the Werther effect and does a really good critique of it. But yeah, she's saying that the sample was also based on a post-war period, but did not acknowledge research around higher increases of suicide during and immediately after wartime. So the Werther effect doesn't account for other things, other factors, basically.
Yeah.
And lastly, Luce says, while the study tried to draw national comparisons of suicide, Phillips did not take into account the regionality of national newspapers in the US. For example, while the New York Times is considered a national newspaper, it mostly covers the New York and northeastern regions of America. The Werther effect has since been a hotly contested piece of research within the field of suicidology, and when trying to replicate Phillips' study, researchers have been frustrated. His results cannot always be discerned, which isn't that surprising when you're looking at that kind of method. I think
with the numbers that you're dealing with as well, like 50 excess deaths linked to a newspaper, like when it's the time frame that you're sort of linked. Like there's lots of like follow-on questions that like I bet that's really hard to replicate. Like, I bet it is.
Even I guess what I'm saying is even if you corrected or improved on all those methodological issues that I just mentioned about sample size and things like that, fundamentally, you are making a claim. Even if you're not saying it's causal, you're saying there is a relationship, a significant and important and meaningful relationship between stories of suicides being reported in the media and then real-life suicides occurring.
Yeah.
And I just don't understand how they are bridging that gap. And frankly, there's so many studies that use the Werther effect at the center of their and variations on it, and some of them improve on his methods and things like that. But they're using the same basic premise.
At its core, that's what you're doing.
Exactly, and you've already decided, or at least hypothesized, what the effect is.
Yeah.
What the cause of the suicides, a rise in suicides is.
Yeah.
But you could come up with an endless list of other things that happened in that year or that month, which could have had a factor, or probably want to break down into the data in terms of was it particular demographics or particular areas of the country, and why might that be? And perhaps most importantly, did any of them see the fucking articles in the New York Times? Did any of them care about it? Why would they?
Yeah.
It doesn't
to claim the
compute.
excess is that as a consequence of that one thing of that's thousands of terrible tragic stories, each that has their own story to tell, which isn't to say individual tragedies can't be clustered together and made meaning out of at a macro level, but it is to say tying that to a single cause. We're back to that thing of suicide is really complicated, and you're not making a complicated claim here, and I'm just very intrigued about that as a theory.
And we've glossed over it a bit, but like also the first example he uses in the study is a Ku Klux Klan member who dies because he's revealed to be Jewish. Like that story would get
very fascinating case study to be like, this is the thing that I'm going to say that other people are going to read. With all of this stuff, like the mechanism, I'm intrigued about the mechanism that you're claiming here, because like you say, like, I could make jokes about this. I'm not going to make jokes about it given the topic. But like the idea that you're in your, you've got the New York Times, you're eating your breakfast, you read about a suicide, and it's like that story in particular, you go, oh, you know what? Today is I'm finally going to do it. This is the story that's going to. I've been given inspiration to finally do something I've been thinking, like, what? Come on. Where is the mechanism here that's causing this?
The even more surprising aspect of it is that he has Marilyn Monroe's suicide in his data set.
Okay.
And there was an increase after that as well. I think it's like 12% increase or something like that in suicides in the month after. But like, I mean, probably that's the example you'd lead with. If you're gonna...
That's the headline, I guess.
Yeah, but anyway. So we've talked about some of the problems with this. It's probably pretty obvious that Ben and I hate this. I knew you would. And yet, like I said, it is one of the most cited, certainly out of all the studies relating to any relationship between the media and suicide, it's one of the most highly cited studies. And it is a method and approach that is replicated and still used again. And the study that I referred to earlier, which found a rise in suicides in the months following the release of 13 Reasons Why, used the same principle. Doing a very similar kind of... it wasn't correlating it with New York Times, it was just correlating it with when the series was released.
But presumably, if you mapped suicides in the US, like it goes up and down. Like it's a really, it's going to be noisy. It's going to go up and down. And if you're talking about like a growth of like, because they're not huge numbers either. So like, 3, 4, 5, 20 excess deaths. I don't know. I'm just placing like, you could place a lot of things on there on a timeline and be like, lots of things come out at any one time. Yeah. And I suppose over, 100 years, I don't know, it's so noisy and it's so messy to be making these sorts of claims of like just put in release of a TV show on that chart that's, I don't like this.
And particularly with regards to, other things that might have been happening in 2017 and, we've joked in the past about like people making arguments about horror in the age of Trump and such and such a kind of media after 9/11 and stuff. But like Donald Trump, when he became the president in early 2017, could that be?
You can speculate about a lot of things.
I'm just to be clear, listeners, I am not making the claim that
he was. I saw him do it.
I'm not making that claim, but there's any number of factors.
Yeah.
Economic factors, political factors, ideological factors.
Sure.
All of the things that they could have consumed. And again, the same problem with the Phillips Werther effect study is there with the study of 13 Reasons Why that I mentioned. There's no evidence that any of the people who were a part of that rise had seen the show, let alone been influenced by it.
Yeah.
And wouldn't you want to know that? If I was in that field, this is the thing that annoys me. If I was researching this stuff and we kept seeing, and there are lots of studies which show some kind of relationship between high-profile incidents of suicide in the media and then a rise in a different context in different countries and things like this. The data's really messy on it. It doesn't work all the time and in every context. But there's enough studies out there where you think, maybe there's something. I don't know. Yeah. But the next step for me, if I was in that field doing that kind of research, I'd be like, all right, well, I really want to dig into that and know, well, is there, like, can we link it to this specific thing?
Yeah.
Because without doing that, well, what's the point? But the impact of this Werther effect is really quite remarkable. And despite, as Anne Luce points out, like, it's been very widely critiqued in the field of suicide studies, not just by media researchers and things. It's been widely critiqued in the field. And yet, whenever there are guidelines that come out, World Health Organization or, reportingонsuicide.org or whatever, or there's a controversial show and people get trotted out from like suicide prevention charities and things, they keep saying things like, We know that this happens.
We know.
So one WHO report states, systematic reviews of these studies have consistently drawn the same conclusion. Media reporting of suicide can lead to imitative suicidal behaviours. It's basically a hypodermic needle approach. This is what in media studies we call a hypodermic needle. The idea that media messages are just implanted into our brains and we don't do anything with them, and the messages don't get changed in that process at all.
Yeah.
And it's just a simple cause and effect, like a drug.
Yeah. It's a quality of evidence that incidentally the World Health Organization wouldn't be making these statements if it was medicine. And there's reasons for that because, studying any sort of social or cultural thing, it kind of by default is harder because, as you're saying, it's really hard to extract and to do like lab-based stuff, and we've looked at that in the past. But like, I genuinely don't think the World Health Organization would be like, the evidence is clear on this if this was like, does apple cause cancer?
Yeah.
Is fruit good for you? Like all of those debates, like even smoking, which is like as causal as you can get when it comes to cancer, they took like 25 years to be like, and I know there's many reasons for why that is the case, and the tobacco industry and other things, but like I just don't think the World Health Organization would be making these claims for actual things that they are experts in and that they really know about. Like it just seems kind of wild to me.
Are you saying the reason we don't know about apples causing cancer is because of Big Orchard and all those the powerful lobbyists they have?
That's next week's episode.
We're coming towards the end. I just want to, before we go on to the conclusion, I want to just briefly touch on a few other studies in this area that just help us to, I guess, make this case that at best this is noisy, messy, complicated, inconsistent data, and at worst it's just wrong or there's no effect.
Yeah.
So there are other studies, for example, that have been done on 13 Reasons Why. I mean, I couldn't believe, by the way, how many studies there are. For a show which only came out 7 years ago, there's about 50-odd published pieces of research on this.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear.
No, because I had to sit through loads of them, Ben. It was terrible. And I resent every single one of them pretty much. Well, there was a handful that were good or interesting or more thoughtful. Final couple of points I wanted to make before we just move on to our conclusion. So we've talked about the Werther effect and some of the problems with that research and that way of researching suicides. There's a lot of other studies which either use versions of the Werther effect or which just study media and media representations of suicide and its potential impact on other suicide in other ways. And I'm not going to go into detail on it. I think you kind of get the gist of, I've made some of the main points already. But yeah, there's a lot of noise to it. There's a lot of inconsistencies. There is research out there by Jane Purkis and others who talk about, for example, the distinction between fictional and non-fictional representations, for example. So there is stuff in the field that talks about that. And they say, even though there is this Werther effect that a lot of the field of suicide studies buys into, when you start applying that to fictional media, the data becomes way noisier and way messier and way more inconsistent than it was already. There were some neat little studies done in the 80s around soap operas like EastEnders. There was a storyline in the late 80s with a character called Angie Watts who takes an overdose, doesn't die from it, but the researchers were interested in whether that had an impact on people taking non-fatal overdoses themselves. And the kinds of findings that came out, like no, there's nothing here. And all the hypotheses that they had were like, well, the effect would probably be stronger in London and then would get less the further away from London you go out because EastEnders is set in London and it is watched by more people proportionally over there. Right. So if there is an effect, if there's a suggestive kind of impact, then you would expect it to be higher in London and then get progressively less the further away you got. And they found the exact opposite of that. Actually, more people in Yorkshire and the Humber and the Northeast were. There was rises in those numbers, but it just didn't work. That none of the numbers added up.
Yeah.
There is also a kind of like evil twin, shall we say, to the Werther effect, which is called the Papageno effect. And when I say evil twin, actually it's the good twin. Maybe Werther effect is the evil twin.
Okay.
The Papageno effect is a empirically observed, statistically significant effect in the research, which shows that there are some media reportings which prevent people from taking their own lives. And so the authors, this is an article that came out in 2010. They say the present findings add that the actual reporting of suicidal ideation itself may contribute to preventing suicide. Media items that focus on individual suicidal ideation may enhance identification with the reported individual and thus highlight the reported outcome as going on living. In other words, when you gave, so all that stuff we said about before about the detail,
Sure.
and understanding why someone might make that decision or why they might be thinking suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
Actually, there is evidence to suggest that there are some representations that have done exactly that. They
Yeah.
have given that detail,
Yeah.
and it has helped people.
Yeah.
It's helped people to connect to it better than they would otherwise have done.
Yeah. This is where I am more sympathetic to our stats-based friends and
Yeah.
colleagues, because this is hard stuff to demonstrate and prove in any meaningful way, one way or another. I'm grateful that people are doing the work in the noise of this. It sounds to me like there are a few chances, and I wish there was more space in the reporting of scientific studies sometimes to be like, we don't know. We maybe, probably not, potentially. It's inconsistent. We've got two competing theories that kind of seem to contradict one another, and both of those might be true. Like, all of this is the process of science, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is difficult stuff. And I wish sometimes people themselves who were reporting on this were a little bit more open and honest, that, like, we don't know.
Yeah.
We probably haven't. But we're quite far removed, when I'm saying that, from where we were when Netflix are literally editing their TV show based on a supposed, bit of evidence that this is going to cause teen suicide.
Right.
When the evidence itself is like, oh, we've been trying it for 60 years. We don't really know.
Yeah, absolutely. And the final study that I wanted to mention is the study that I mentioned earlier by Anne Luce, who I should probably point out is a friend of mine, and I have had conversations with her about this topic, and she's been super helpful in helping me to understand this.
I don't think you've got friends, but sure.
Well, I had friends before I met you. Now I only need you, Ben.
We've got a
Friends
podcast
forever.
together.
Yeah. Podcast friends. The final thing I wanted to mention, I said I was going to come back to it before. I do think it's an important example because it was such a big media story back in 2008, which was the Bridgend suicide cluster.
The Bridgend, yeah.
Again, if you're interested in this topic, go and read Anne Luce's book. It's called The Bridgend Suicide in the Media. She does a really comprehensive breakdown of the media coverage over time, statistical analysis on things, qualitative analysis of the coverage and things like this. It's really, really good. But her takeaway from it is that actually the claim that we heard in the beginning of this episode, that clip that we listened to, the idea that a charity told
the global press don't report on it.
Don't report on this, and it went down. That is not true.
Okay.
What Anne Luce found was that every time the coverage started to decline, so there was all sorts of problems with the reporting. It was sensationalized.
I bet.
It was blown up into, like, there
bet.
was literally tabloids keeping tallies of the, like, death count and things like this. Like, horrendous. Like, you know what the tabloid press is like in this country.
Yeah.
It was also partly linked to social media panics. It was 2008, so it was basically journalists not understanding how social media works and how social media, what it means to be a friend with someone on social media.
Right.
Doesn't mean you're mates with them and you've been influenced by them, but people were talking about suicide cults and suicide clubs.
I remember suicide
and
cults and pacts.
things like that.
Yeah.
But the other thing she found out in response to that claim about telling the global press to stop reporting and then the suicide stopped is just not true. Luce found that every time the coverage was declining, someone from either the third sector, like charities, or the police would then come out and say, hey, you need to stop reporting on this. And then the coverage would go up again.
Right.
And that happened multiple times.
Right.
And also, the suicides that they're talking about started before the reporting on it. Like there were several suicides linked to each other before the reporting started. So none of that really adds up to a conclusion that of contagion.
It's consistent, yeah.
That maps onto the Werther effect. All right, well, we've gone through the research, we've looked at the controversy, we've reached the conclusion. And I kind of want to wrap up with a couple of points, really. One of which is to kind of reiterate the idea that I do think this is a really interesting TV series, which I think gives a very thoughtful, complex, nuanced exploration of teen suicide. I think it's quite obvious at this point, I don't believe the claims that are, the direct claims that are being made about the potential effects or influences. And I do find it problematic that a lot of the evidence that is put forward to suggest that there has been an effect is really just population level stuff where there's no evidence of people actually having watched the show.
Sure.
It's only interested in numbers. It's got no interest in the precise mechanisms by which this is supposed to work.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, to me, the show, when I was watching it back the other day, I thought this is kind of, the show is a bit like the qualitative explanation of suicide, which is so often only explained through quants and statistics. It presents this really, thoughtful, multifaceted portrait of suicide, in which everyone is playing a part. Hannah obviously is the kind of at the center of it, and Clay, who is kind of like listening to these tapes, but all the other characters who either received a tape themselves or who were just there, like part of the environment, part of this, all these themes around slut shaming and misogyny and bullying and stuff like that, which is also a big part of it. The other thing which we touched on was that there are loads more, much better explanations for suicide out there. You probably wouldn't say explanations, you'd probably say risk factors. Most health literature, public health research doesn't really talk about causes so much as risk factors. What are the things that we know? If you have these things, you're at a higher risk of suicide. And there's loads of them, and it's there in the research. So Franklin et al., 2016, Risk Factors for Suicide Thoughts and Behaviors. This is a meta-analysis of 50 years of research, and it has 16 different categories, including things like genetics and cognitive problems and demographics and psychopathology and personality traits, physical illness, prior self-injurious thoughts or behaviors, all sorts of things that can give you a lens into that someone might be at higher risk. I don't understand why we're fixating on a TV show. And as you suggested before, Ben, the thing that really winds me up about this is the opportunity cost of spending so much time. Like I said, there are 50 plus studies on 13 Reasons Why it alone. And these are smart people who want to prevent suicides and want to understand it better. Yeah. And collectively, they're, for my money, wasting a lot of good time and resources exploring things that aren't helping the problem. I just wanted to end then. We've kind of told this story of allegations of suicide contagion, or at least concerns over suicide contagion. We've seen quite a lot of familiar tropes around the idea of the vulnerable teen audience who maybe can't distinguish fact from fiction.
They're back again, those vulnerable teens.
All that kind of thing.
Recurring character on this show.
I wanted to end by thinking about actual effects in the qualitative sense. So what evidence do we have? And there isn't very much, admittedly, but what can we say about actual teenagers who watched this series?
Okay, interesting.
How did they think about it? And one example that I came across, which I thought was a nice point to end on, was a story from a school in Oxford, Michigan, who had 2 suicides in their school, and around the same time, or I think just before the series came out. Yeah. And their response to it was, I think, a really interesting one.
Okay, I'm really interested in this.
Just a heads up, listeners, some of you might find this quite difficult to listen to. It does involve some people talking about their suicidal feelings. But it's a news report by ABC News, from that school.
What do you guys think about the show?
Some parts I had to turn away just because it was a lot to handle.
When you talk about what was a lot to handle, like what?
Like the ending part where she killed herself was really hard to watch.
Here in Oxford, in recent years, 2 young students taking their own lives, one after the other, Shane Reshuk and Megan Abbott. In response to the show and in honor of them, a small group of brave students are taking a drastic step by broadcasting their deepest secrets in the classroom for the entire student body to hear. Kayla, the volleyball player.
This is a story of my life, or more specifically, how it almost ended. One day I heard the worst thing someone could ever hear. Why don't you just go kill yourself? I thought to myself, would anything really change if I wasn't here?
For 13 days, one story shared over the school loudspeaker. Riley, an aspiring scientist.
Worthless, self-centered, no morals, easy, grimy, cake face. You would be better off dead. I was afraid. For the time you laid your hands on me, for when I started to believe I actually would be better off dead.
Even Jordan, the basketball star.
A lot of days, though, I walk into the school after getting a text like this one. Do not talk to me anymore. Don't call me anymore. I'm going to show you, you little mother. The only reason why you have a relationship with me is for money, you user. It is not easy to hear those words.
They call their project 13 Reasons Why Not, singling out at least one person who helped them. Kayla thanking her friend Alexa.
You to this day may not know that your words talked me out of hurting myself. You are one of the 13 reasons why not.
And Jordan with a message.
Suicide is never the answer. There's always a reason why not. Let's be each other's why nots.
Pretty powerful clip.
Yeah, our producer is literally in tears over there. I don't think there's much of a dry eye in the house. That's really moving and affecting and powerful. Yeah.
One of the reasons I wanted to show that to hear that clip is to kind of think about, well, this is what happens when journalists actually spoke to teen audiences who watch the show. And even though the journalist starts by asking, what did you think of it? And she said, I didn't like it. Her response was, it upset me.
Yeah.
It made her feel sad because presumably she's gone through some experiences which she can relate to the fictional things that she's seen. It's not the same kind of not liking it. It's not anywhere. It's not even in the same ballpark as the kind of claims that we talked about before about this being, influencing them to do something. In fact, what we see is the exact opposite.
People
it is
have
inspired.
Very complicated responses to media texts. We've always said that, and those responses are rooted in their own biographies and their own experiences and their own relationships to, in this case, suicide, and the things that emerge out of that can be really, really complex and complicated as well.
Yeah, and there's also in all the research that I found, I did say that I got annoyed by a lot of it, and that is absolutely true. But I did also find some interesting work from people who work with young people, like youth care workers, who talked about. I thought from the title that it was going to be one that would annoy me. It was called Glorifying Suicide, ? Radical Encounters with Difficult Texts, Radical Approaches to Youth Care.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, they talk in that about a YouTube episode, Teens Reacting to 13 Reasons Why. And there's a 17-year-old girl called Layla in it who watches one of the scenes where Hannah experiences gendered violence and is slut-shamed. Layla recoils, looks away, and is visibly upset. And then the authors of this chapter say, as youth workers, it is our responsibility to inquire as to why Layla might say something as apparently neutral as she is not a big fan, and simultaneously have such a strong embodied negative response. Other youth note that the show is important, but it negatively depicts youth who are struggling with mental health issues. An argument we contend neglects an engagement with everyday forms of sexism that girls encounter that would make them mad, and locates the critiques the text makes as sufficient only if it connects suicide to pathology. They basically go on to say that they think 13 Reasons Why has shown them a route into, I guess, tweaking their approach to youth care. And they say that they conclude their piece by saying we have to basically unlearn a lot of conventional and mainstream suicide prevention techniques, the emphasis on hotlines and trigger warnings and videos and websites that you go to. They say if we can instead engage in a praxis of love, then we can imagine that love be radical, and in doing so allows us as youth workers to challenge normalised suicide intervention frameworks and work towards creating new conditions for living that address the reasons why youth consider suicide, catch youth before they are in crisis, and mobilise the knowledge that being in and experiencing crisis is okay. And they also really talk about the need to own their own complicity in this as well. That they are in a position to help these young people do this, but also be aware that they potentially could exacerbate things if they don't do their job properly.
Interesting.
So the show has inspired the youth workers to do that. It's inspired these actual teenagers to set up this 13 Reasons Why Not, to use the framing of the show's tapes kind of premise as a way of saying we can tell a story about why we didn't take our own lives, and I really appreciated that take. Well, I think that about brings us to a close. I've really enjoyed talking that through, despite being difficult, challenging subject matter. Yeah. I learned a hell of a lot through doing this research, and I hope you found it interesting as well.
Yeah, really interesting stuff.
Cool. Well, thanks to all you listeners for paying attention and making it with us to the end as well. I've been Rich.
I'm Ben.
And if you like what we do, as always, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen. And if you have time, please leave a review or recommend us to a friend. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IllEffectsPod. We'll be back in 2 weeks. We'll see you then. You've been listening to Ill Effects. This episode was researched by Richard McCulloch, produced by Rachel Wood, produced and edited by Caroline Pringle, edited and mixed by Colin Frank. The music for our episodes was created by Brutalust, which is Colin Frank and Maria Sappho, and recorded and mixed by Joe Crispin.